King Edmund sat in his private study, the weight of the crown feeling heavier than usual on his mahogany desk, where it rested beside stacks of official papers. Outside the tall windows of Thornwick Palace, the autumn rain painted streaks down the glass, mirroring the turmoil in his mind. His marriage to Lady Catherine had brought him happiness he never expected to find after the death of his first wife. But it had also brought complications he was still learning to navigate. The door creaked open, and his private secretary, Lord Pemberton, entered with measured steps. His usually composed face bore the slight tension that Edmund had come to recognize as a harbinger of difficult news. "Your Majesty," Pemberton began, his voice carefully neutral. "The Ashford family has requested another audience regarding the upcoming state dinner." Edmund's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The Ashfords, Catherine's relatives, had been a source of growing concern since his marriage 6 months ago. While Catherine herself was everything a queen should be, graceful, intelligent, and genuinely caring about their subjects, her family was another matter entirely. "What is it this time?" Edmund asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Lord Ashford wishes to discuss the seating arrangements. He believes his position as the Queen's brother entitles him to sit at the high table during the state visit from the Kingdom of Valdres. He's also submitted a list of business associates he'd like invited to the private reception." Edmund stood and walked to the window, watching the palace guards patrol the grounds in their scarlet uniforms. Each step they took was precise, disciplined, qualities that seemed entirely foreign to Catherine's family. In the 6 months since the wedding, the Ashfords had made increasingly bold requests. They had asked for royal appointments for unqualified friends, demanded access to private royal events for their business contacts, and consistently tried to leverage their connection to the throne for personal gain. "And Lady Ashford?" Edmund inquired, referring to Catherine's sister-in-law. "She's requested permission to use the royal coat of arms on her new jewelry line. She claims it would be a modest tribute to family unity." The irony wasn't lost on Edmund. Unity was exactly what the Ashford family seemed determined to undermine. They had taken his love for Catherine and twisted it into an opportunity for social climbing and financial gain. What troubled him most was how oblivious they seemed to be about the damage they were causing to the monarchy's reputation. Reports had already begun appearing in the more sensational newspapers, questioning whether the new Queen's family was using their position inappropriately. The palace's reputation, carefully maintained over generations, was beginning to suffer. Edmund's advisors had been increasingly vocal about their concerns, though none had yet dared to suggest the radical solution that had been growing in his mind. "Where is the Queen?" Edmund asked. "Her Majesty is in the East Wing, meeting with the children's charity representatives. She's reviewing proposals for the new literacy program." Edmund smiled despite his troubles. Catherine's dedication to charitable work was genuine and tireless. She had thrown herself into her royal duties with an enthusiasm that impressed even the most skeptical courtiers. The contrast between her behavior and that of her family was stark and painful. As if summoned by his thoughts, Catherine appeared in the doorway. Her brown hair was elegantly styled, though a few strands had escaped during her busy afternoon. Her eyes, usually bright with warmth, showed signs of the stress she'd been under lately. "Pemberton mentioned you wanted to see me," she said, dismissing the secretary with a grateful nod. Edmund waited until they were alone before speaking. "We need to discuss your family." Catherine's face fell, and she sank into one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "What have they done now?" "It's not any single incident," Edmund said carefully, taking the chair beside her rather than returning to his imposing position behind the desk. "It's the pattern, the constant requests, the presumption, the way they seem to view our marriage as their personal gateway to influence and profit." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap. "I've tried talking to them," she finally said. Richard thinks he's helping by promoting business connections. He doesn't understand that it looks improper. And Sarah, she sees the jewelry venture as a celebration of our family's new status, not as exploitation. The press is starting to notice, Edmund said gently. Yesterday's Evening Herald ran a piece questioning whether royal connections are being sold to the highest bidder. They didn't mention names, but anyone paying attention would know exactly who they meant. What do you want me to do? Catherine asked, though her voice suggested she already suspected the answer. Edmund took her hands in his. I think we need to establish some distance. Clear boundaries. Your family needs to understand that being related to the Queen doesn't entitle them to special access or privileges. And if they don't accept those boundaries? The question hung in the air between them. Edmund had been dreading this conversation for weeks, but recent events had made it unavoidable. The Kingdom of Valdris was sending their crown prince for a state visit, a crucial diplomatic opportunity that could affect trade relationships for decades. The last thing they needed was the Ashford family, treating it as a networking event. Then they won't be invited to royal events, Edmund said quietly. Including state occasions? Catherine's face went pale. All of them? Even for major ceremonies? If necessary, yes. The room fell silent except for the sound of rain against the windows. Edmund watched his wife process this information, seeing the conflict playing out across her features. He knew how much her family meant to her, despite their flaws. The Ashfords had supported her through difficult times long before she'd ever imagined becoming queen. What about the wedding anniversary celebration next month? Catherine asked. We've already announced it as a family affair. We'll need to reconsider the guest list. Catherine stood abruptly and walked to the window, her reflection ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass. They'll never understand. They'll think I've abandoned them for the crown. Have you? Edmund asked quietly. She turned to face him, and he saw tears in her eyes that she was fighting to hold back. No, but they might see it that way. Richard especially. He's struggled since Father died. The business hasn't been doing well, and I think he saw my marriage as a solution to his problems. That's exactly the problem, Edmund said, rising to join her at the window. The monarchy can't be anyone's solution to financial or social problems. The moment we allow that perception to take hold, we compromise everything the crown stands for. They stood together looking out at the grounds where palace staff were going about their duties despite the weather. Edmund thought about the hundreds of people who depended on the royal household for their livelihoods, the thousands who looked to the monarchy for stability and moral leadership, the entire nation that expected their sovereign to be above personal interest and political manipulation. When will you make the announcement? Catherine asked. There won't be an announcement, Edmund replied. This isn't about public shaming. It's about quiet, firm boundaries. Your family simply won't receive invitations to events where their presence would be inappropriate. Starting with the Valdris visit? Starting with the Valdris visit. Catherine nodded slowly, though her expression remained troubled. I should be the one to tell them. Are you sure? They're my family. If this message needs to be delivered, it should come from me. Edmund admired her courage, even as he worried about the emotional toll this would take on her. What will you say? The truth. That royal protocol requires us to be selective about guest lists for state occasions. That private family celebrations and official ceremonies serve different purposes. That I love them, but I also have duties that sometimes require difficult decisions. And if they don't accept it? Catherine was quiet for a long time. Then we'll know where we stand. Later that evening, after Catherine had retired to her private chambers to prepare for the difficult conversation with her family, Edmund found himself walking the palace corridors alone. The halls were dimly lit by wall sconces, casting long shadows between the portraits of his ancestors. Each painted face seemed to watch him with knowing eyes, as if they understood the weight of the decision he'd just made. He paused before a portrait of his great-grandfather, King William, who had ruled during a time of great social change. The history books praised William's ability to adapt royal traditions to modern expectations while maintaining the dignity and integrity of the crown. Edmund wondered what advice the old king might have offered about balancing personal loyalty with royal duty. The sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. Lord Pemberton approached with his usual measured pace, carrying a folder of correspondence. "The evening dispatches, Your Majesty," Pemberton said, offering the folder. Edmund accepted it, but didn't immediately open it. "Pemberton, in your experience, what happens when a royal marriage creates complications for the crown?" The older man considered the question carefully. "History suggests that such complications, if left unaddressed, tend to compound over time. The most successful royal marriages have been those where both spouses understood that their personal relationships must serve the greater good of the monarchy. Even when that means disappointing people they care about? Especially then, Your Majesty, the crown cannot afford to appear partial or compromised. Once that perception takes hold, it becomes very difficult to restore public confidence." Edmund nodded, finding some comfort in the seasoned advisor's words. "What's your assessment of the Queen's position in all this?" "Her Majesty has conducted herself with remarkable dignity, considering the pressures she's faced. The public respects her commitment to her charitable work and her obvious dedication to her royal duties. If anything, her family's behavior has made her own character shine more brightly in comparison. But she's walking a difficult line. The longer this situation continues, the more likely it becomes that she'll be forced to choose publicly between her family and her crown. Such moments define a reign, Your Majesty." They walked together toward Edmund's private apartments, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet runners. The palace felt larger and quieter than usual, as if the very walls were holding their breath in anticipation of what was to come. "Have we received any response from the Valdres Embassy regarding the state visit arrangements?" Edmund asked. "Prince Marcus will arrive with a delegation of 12, as planned. They're particularly interested in discussing the new trade agreements, and they've expressed appreciation for the ceremonial aspects of the visit. The prince apparently has great respect for royal tradition." The irony wasn't lost on Edmund. Here was a foreign prince who understood and valued the dignity of royal protocol, while his own wife's family seemed determined to treat it as an opportunity for self-promotion. As they reached the junction where their paths would diverge, Pemberton paused. "Your Majesty, if I may speak freely." "Of course. The decision you've made regarding the Queen's family, it won't be easy for either of you. But it's the right decision. The crown must always come first, not because it's more important than personal relationships, but because it represents something larger than any individual, including the king himself." After Pemberton departed, Edmund stood alone in the corridor, feeling the weight of centuries of royal tradition pressing down on his shoulders. Tomorrow, Catherine would have one of the most difficult conversations of her life. Her family would be hurt, confused, and possibly angry. They might never forgive her for what they would likely see as a betrayal. But the alternative, allowing the monarchy to be slowly compromised by personal interests, was unthinkable. Edmund had sworn an oath to preserve and protect the crown, not just for himself, but for future generations. Sometimes that oath required sacrifices that cut deeply into the heart. He thought about Catherine, alone in her chambers, preparing to disappoint people she loved for the sake of duties she had never been born to, but had accepted completely. Her strength in this situation only made him love her more, even as it highlighted the painful complexity of their position. The rain had stopped, and pale moonlight now filtered through the tall windows, casting silver patterns on the floor. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed midnight, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new tests of their commitment to the crown and to each other. Edmund finally made his way to his private study, where he would spend the next hour reviewing diplomatic correspondence and preparing for meetings with his advisors. The work of being king never truly stopped, but tonight it felt particularly heavy. Every decision rippled outward in ways that affected not just him and Catherine, but everyone whose lives touched theirs. As he settled into his chair and opened the first document, Edmund reflected on the cruel irony of royal life. The very position that had brought him and Catherine together now required them to make choices that tested the bonds they held most dear. Love, in their world, was never simple. It always came with conditions, expectations, and responsibilities that ordinary people never had to consider. But perhaps that was what made their love stronger. The fact that it had to survive in such challenging circumstances. Tomorrow would test that strength in new ways, but Edmund had faith that both he and Catherine understood what was at stake. The crown demanded everything from those who wore it, including the courage to disappoint the people they loved most when duty called. The decision was made. Now they would all have to live with the consequences. The morning sun struggled through the heavy curtains of Ashford Manor, casting weak light across the breakfast room, where Lord Richard Ashford sat staring at his untouched plate of eggs. The newspaper lay folded beside his coffee cup, its headline announcing the upcoming state visit from the Kingdom of Valdres. What the headline didn't mention was that the Ashford family would not be attending. His wife, Lady Sarah Ashford, entered the room with an air of barely contained agitation. She had spent the night pacing their bedroom, replaying Catherine's visit from 3 days ago over and over in her mind. The Queen had arrived alone, without her usual security detail, looking more like the uncertain young woman who had once been simply their sister-in-law than the confident royal figure she had become. "Still nothing?" Sarah asked, settling into her chair with unusual stiffness. Richard shook his head. "No word from the palace. No invitation. No explanation beyond what Catherine told us." The conversation with Queen Catherine had been civilized but devastating. She had spoken carefully about royal protocol and the need for appropriate boundaries at state occasions. Her words had been diplomatic, almost rehearsed, but her eyes had revealed the pain she felt at delivering them. "I don't understand it," Sarah said, reaching for her teacup with trembling hands. 6 months ago, we were family. Now we're suddenly inappropriate for public occasions. "She's changed," Richard muttered, finally taking a bite of his breakfast without tasting it. "The crown has changed her." But even as he said it, Richard knew it wasn't entirely true. Catherine hadn't changed so much as she had been forced to choose between conflicting loyalties. The real question was whether they had pushed her too far with their assumptions about what royal connections could provide. The butler entered quietly and placed a small silver tray beside Richard's plate. On it lay a single envelope bearing the royal seal. Both Richard and Sarah stared at it for a long moment before Richard opened it with hands that shook slightly. The letter was brief and formal. Signed by Lord Pemberton rather than the King or Queen personally, it thanked the Ashford family for their understanding regarding the state dinner arrangements and expressed hope that they might join their majesties for a private family dinner the following month. "A private family dinner," Sarah read over his shoulder, "after the important guests have gone home." The sound of footsteps in the entrance hall announced the arrival of their adult children. James, their eldest son, appeared in the doorway with his wife Helen. Behind them came their daughter Margaret, who had been particularly excited about the prospect of meeting foreign royalty. "Any word about the state visit?" James asked, though his parents' expressions had already given him his answer. "We're not invited," Sarah said flatly. "Apparently, we're not suitable for such elevated company," Margaret's face fell. She had already purchased a new gown for the occasion and had spent weeks reading about Valdres diplomatic history. But Aunt Catherine promised. Your Aunt Catherine has apparently learned to make different kinds of promises now, Richard said bitterly. Helen, who had always been more observant than her husband, studied her in-laws carefully. What exactly did she say when she came to visit? Sarah recounted the conversation, though her version emphasized Catherine's formal tone and minimized the obvious distress the Queen had shown. As she spoke, Helen noticed the details that suggested a more complex story. How Catherine had come alone, how she had lingered at the door as if hoping for a different kind of conversation, how she had repeatedly emphasized her love for the family, even as she delivered disappointing news. It sounds like she didn't have much choice, Helen said quietly. There's always a choice, Richard snapped. She chose the crown over her family. But Helen wasn't convinced. In the months since Catherine's marriage, she had watched the royal couple at public events and had seen how they looked at each other. This wasn't about Catherine choosing anything over her family. It was about pressure from somewhere else entirely. Meanwhile, at Thornwick Palace, Catherine was dealing with her own aftermath. She had barely slept since visiting her family, and the upcoming state dinner felt more like an ordeal than an opportunity. She stood in her private sitting room, reviewing the final guest list with her secretary, Miss Hartwell. The seating arrangements have been finalized, Your Majesty, Miss Hartwell reported. Prince Marcus will be seated to Your Majesty's right, with the Valdres Trade Minister beside him. The Archbishop will say the blessing, and the King's cousin will represent the extended royal family. Catherine nodded absently, her mind still on the hurt she had seen in Richard's eyes. She understood his disappointment, but she wasn't sure he understood the impossible position she found herself in. Every action she took as queen was scrutinized, analyzed, and judged by people who had never faced such competing demands. Miss Hartwell, Catherine said suddenly, in your experience, how do other royal families handle situations like this? The secretary, a diplomatic woman in her 50s who had served the previous queen, chose her words carefully. Each situation is unique, Your Majesty, but history shows that successful royal families are those where everyone understands their role and respects appropriate boundaries. It's never easy, but it's necessary. Even when it hurts people you care about? Especially then, Your Majesty. The crown requires sacrifices from everyone it touches, not just from the king and queen. That afternoon, Catherine decided to visit the palace gardens, hoping that the autumn air might clear her mind. She found Edmund already there, walking along the rose beds that were now showing their final blooms before winter. He looked up as she approached, and she saw in his eyes the same weight she felt in her heart. Any word from your family? He asked gently. A very polite note thanking us for the invitation to a private dinner next month, Catherine replied. Nothing about the state visit. They walked together in silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. The palace grounds were beautifully maintained, every hedge perfectly trimmed, every path carefully swept. It was a picture of order and control that contrasted sharply with the emotional chaos Catherine felt inside. Do you ever regret it? She asked suddenly. Marrying someone with such complicated family connections? Edmund stopped walking and turned to face her. Never, he said firmly. But I do regret that our marriage has put you in such an impossible position. It's not your fault. Isn't it? I knew what the expectations would be. I should have prepared your family better, helped them understand what royal life would require. Catherine considered this. Would it have made a difference? Richard has always been ambitious. Sarah has always wanted to be part of something grander than our modest family background. I'm not sure any amount of preparation would have changed their expectations. As they continued their walk, They passed several palace staff members who bowed respectfully as they went about their duties. Catherine watched them work with quiet efficiency, people who understood their roles and performed them without drama or demands for special treatment. She envied them their clarity of purpose. "The Prince of Valdres arrives tomorrow," Edmund said. "Are you ready?" "As ready as I can be," Catherine replied. "Miss Hartwell has briefed me extensively on Valdres history and customs. I understand this visit could lead to significant trade benefits for our kingdom." "That's not what I meant." Catherine knew exactly what he meant. The state dinner would be her first major royal event since establishing boundaries with her family. The newspapers would be watching to see how she handled herself, particularly given the rumors that had been circulating about royal family tensions. "I'll be fine," she said, though she wasn't entirely convinced herself. That evening, Richard Ashford sat in his study at the manor, a glass of whiskey in his hand and a pile of business correspondence on his desk. The textile company he had inherited from his father was struggling, and the orders that had begun to increase after Catherine's marriage had suddenly dropped off. It seemed that business associates who had been eager to cultivate connections with the Queen's family were now having second thoughts. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Sarah entered, carrying a cup of tea and wearing the determined expression that usually meant she had made a decision about something. "I've been thinking," she announced, settling into the chair across from his desk. "About what?" "About Catherine. About what she said when she came to visit." Richard looked up from his papers. "What about it?" "She looked miserable, Richard. Absolutely miserable. This wasn't someone who was enjoying the power to exclude her family. This was someone who was being forced to make a choice she didn't want to make. So maybe we pushed too hard. Maybe we made assumptions we shouldn't have made." Richard set down his glass and studied his wife's face. "Are you saying this is our fault?" "I'm saying maybe it's nobody's fault. Maybe this is just what happens when someone in the family becomes queen. Maybe there are rules and expectations that we never bothered to understand." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken regrets filling the space between them. Richard thought about the business contacts he had tried to cultivate, the social invitations he had extended on the assumption that his royal connection would be welcomed, the ways he had tried to leverage Catherine's position without really thinking about how it might affect her. "What do you think we should do?" he asked finally. "I think we should write her a letter," Sarah said. "Not asking for anything, not complaining about anything, just telling her we love her and we understand that being queen means making difficult decisions. Even if it means we're excluded from events we want to attend, even if it means that." The next morning, as Prince Marcus of Valdres arrived at Thornwick Palace with appropriate ceremony, the Ashford family was dealing with a different kind of arrival. The morning newspapers carried extensive coverage of the state visit, complete with photographs of the royal couple greeting their distinguished guests. Margaret Ashford sat at her dressing table, looking at a photograph of Catherine in the society pages. The Queen looked radiant in a deep blue gown, every inch the confident royal figure. But Margaret, who had known Catherine since childhood, could see something else in her aunt's smile, a hint of the sadness she was carrying. "She looks beautiful," Helen said, appearing in the doorway of Margaret's room. "She looks lonely," Margaret replied. Helen joined her daughter-in-law at the dressing table, and together they studied the newspaper photographs. "Your father-in-law has decided to write her a letter." "What kind of letter?" "The kind she needs to receive, I think. One that lets her know her family understands the position she's in." Margaret nodded slowly. "It can't be easy, always having to choose between what you want to do and what you're supposed to do." "No," Helen agreed. "I don't think it can be." At the palace, the state dinner was proceeding with flawless precision. Prince Marcus had proven to be a charming guest. knowledgeable about diplomatic protocol and genuinely interested in strengthening ties between their kingdoms. The conversation around the royal table focused on trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and mutual security concerns. Catherine played her role perfectly, engaging the prince in discussions about his country's famous universities while ensuring that other guests felt included in the conversation. To any observer, she appeared completely at ease in her royal duties. But Edmund, who knew her better than anyone, could see the effort she was putting into maintaining her composed facade. During a brief pause between courses, he caught her eye and gave her a small, encouraging smile. She responded with a look of gratitude that reminded him why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. "Your Majesty," Prince Marcus said. Turning to Catherine, "I understand you've been involved in literacy programs for children. We've had similar initiatives in Valdres, and I'd be interested in discussing possible collaboration." Catherine's face brightened with genuine enthusiasm as she began describing her work with local schools. This was the part of royal life she truly enjoyed, the opportunity to make a real difference in people's lives. For a few minutes, she forgot about family tensions and state protocol, losing herself in a subject she cared deeply about. As the evening progressed, Edmund found himself reflecting on the strange nature of their lives. Here they were, surrounded by diplomatic elegance and ceremonial grandeur, discussing matters of international importance with people they barely knew, while the people Catherine loved most in the world sat at home, excluded from this glittering occasion. It was the price they paid for the crown, he realized. Not just the formal duties and public scrutiny, but the way royal life created distance between them and the personal relationships that had shaped them before they became king and queen. After the last guest had departed and the staff had begun cleaning up, Catherine finally allowed herself to sit down in her private chambers. Her feet ached from standing in formal shoes all evening, and her face was tired from maintaining a diplomatic smile for hours. A soft knock at her door announced the arrival of Miss Hartwell, carrying a small silver tray with the evening's correspondence. "Just a few personal letters, Your Majesty," the secretary said quietly. Catherine recognized her brother's handwriting immediately. The letter was brief but heartfelt, expressing love and understanding rather than disappointment or anger. As she read Richard's words, tears began to form in her eyes, not tears of sadness but of relief. The letter didn't ask for anything or complain about their exclusion from the state dinner. Instead, it simply acknowledged that being queen meant making difficult choices and assured her that her family's love wasn't conditional on royal invitations or social access. For the first time in days, Catherine felt as if she could breathe properly. The quiet storm that had been building in her heart began to settle, replaced by a sense that perhaps, with time and understanding, her family could find a new way to be part of her life without compromising her royal duties. The price of the crown was high, but it didn't have to cost her everything she held dear. It would just require everyone to learn new ways of loving each other across the complicated landscape of royal life. 6 months had passed since the Valdres state visit, and the palace had settled into a rhythm that reflected the new realities of royal life. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Queen's private study as Catherine reviewed reports from her various charitable foundations. The literacy program she had discussed with Prince Marcus had blossomed into a successful collaboration between their kingdoms, with teachers and resources being exchanged to benefit children in both countries. A soft knock interrupted her concentration. Miss Hartwell entered with her usual efficiency, carrying a folder of correspondence and wearing the subtle smile that meant good news. "Your Majesty, the final arrangements for next week's private family gathering have been confirmed," she announced. "Lord Pemberton has approved the security arrangements, and the kitchen staff is prepared for a more intimate setting." Catherine nodded, feeling a familiar mix of anticipation and nervousness. The monthly family dinners that had begun as a compromise had gradually evolved into something more meaningful. What had started as an obligation had become an opportunity for her family to understand her world while she remained connected to theirs. "How many will be attending this month?" Catherine asked. "8, Your Majesty. Lord and Lady Ashford, their children, and the grandchildren. Master Timothy specifically requested the chocolate soufflé that Cook prepared last time." Catherine smiled at the mention of her nephew, Richard's youngest son. Timothy was 7 years old and had adapted to royal protocol with the easy flexibility of childhood. He called her Aunt Queen and showed equal enthusiasm for her crown and for the palace's remarkable collection of toy soldiers. The evolution of her relationship with her family hadn't been immediate or easy. The first few family dinners had been stilted affairs, with everyone carefully avoiding topics that might cause tension. Richard had been formal to the point of discomfort, Sarah had seemed afraid to express opinions about anything, and the children had treated the palace like a museum where they might accidentally break something priceless. But gradually, as they all learned to navigate this new dynamic, the gatherings had become more natural. Catherine had worked hard to create an atmosphere where her family could relax while still respecting the dignity of the royal household. Her relatives had learned to appreciate the significance of her position without constantly trying to leverage it for personal benefit. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and there had been setbacks along the way. 3 months earlier, Richard had suggested bringing a business associate to a family dinner, apparently forgetting the lessons of the past year. Catherine had to remind him firmly but kindly that family gatherings were exactly that, for family only. He had been embarrassed by his mistake, but the incident had served as a reminder that old habits sometimes resurged. There had been positive changes as well. Sarah had redirected her entrepreneurial energy into a legitimate jewelry business that made no mention of royal connections in its marketing. Her designs were selling well based on their own merit, and she had found genuine satisfaction in success that belonged entirely to her own efforts. Richard's textile company had stabilized as he focused on building relationships based on quality and reliability rather than social connections. Most importantly, the family had learned to value their access to Catherine for what it truly was, a chance to maintain their bonds with someone they loved, rather than an opportunity for advancement. Later that morning, Catherine joined Edmund in the garden where they often took their private discussions. The autumn weather was crisp but pleasant, and the grounds were showing the results of the gardener's careful preparations for winter. They walked along the gravel paths, their conversation turning to the various matters that required their attention. "The Valdres trade delegation will be returning next month," Edmund mentioned. "Prince Marcus has specifically requested that you be involved in the education discussions." "I'd be delighted," Catherine replied. "The teacher exchange program has exceeded all our expectations. The children in both countries are benefiting tremendously." They paused near the fountain at the center of the main garden, where the sound of falling water provided a peaceful backdrop for their conversation. Edmund studied his wife's face, noting how much more relaxed she appeared compared to the stressed woman she had been during the first months of their marriage. "You've found your balance," he observed. "I think so," Catherine agreed. "It took longer than I expected, but yes, I understand now that loving my family doesn't mean giving them everything they want, and being queen doesn't mean cutting myself off from everyone I cared about before. What do you think made the difference?" Catherine considered the question carefully. "Time, mostly, and the realization that protecting my family from the temptations of royal access was actually a way of protecting our relationships. When Richard stopped seeing me as a business opportunity and started seeing me as his sister again, everything improved." They continued their walk, discussing the various projects Catherine had undertaken since finding her footing as queen. Her work with children's charities had expanded beyond literacy to include programs for underprivileged youth, and support for families in crisis. She had also begun hosting regular tea parties for elderly citizens, creating an informal way for the monarchy to connect with ordinary people. "The newspapers have been increasingly positive about your public work," Edmund noted. "They've been fair," Catherine acknowledged. "I think they appreciate that I'm not using my position for personal drama or family promotion. The focus stays on the work itself." Indeed, the press coverage had shifted dramatically over the past months. Early reports had focused on speculation about royal family tensions and questions about Catherine's ability to balance personal and public loyalties. Recent coverage emphasized her dedication to charitable work and her growing reputation as a working royal who took her duties seriously. The transformation had been noticed beyond the kingdom's borders as well. Foreign diplomatic wives had begun requesting meetings with Catherine to discuss collaborative charitable efforts. Her literacy program with Valdres had inspired similar initiatives with other allied nations. That afternoon, Catherine spent time reviewing preparations for the upcoming family dinner. She had learned that these gatherings required as much careful planning as state occasions, though the challenges were different. Instead of diplomatic protocol, she had to consider family dynamics. Instead of international relations, she had to navigate personal sensitivities. The menu was planned to include dishes that would appeal to all ages while maintaining the quality expected at a royal table. The setting was formal enough to remind everyone of the significance of the occasion, but comfortable enough to encourage genuine conversation. Most importantly, the atmosphere was designed to celebrate their family bonds while respecting the boundaries that had proven necessary. Miss Hartwell appeared with the final details for the evening's arrangements. "Your Majesty, cook has prepared the chocolate souffle as requested, and she's also included the herb-crusted lamb that Lord Ashford particularly enjoyed last time. The children's menu includes the simplified versions of the main courses, and there will be activities available if the younger ones need entertainment between courses." "Perfect," Catherine said. "What about the gift situation?" This had been another area requiring careful navigation. Early family dinners had been complicated by Richard and Sarah's tendency to bring expensive gifts that seemed designed to impress rather than to express genuine affection. Catherine had eventually established a gentle but firm policy that gifts should be modest and personal, more suited to family exchanges than royal presentations. "Lady Ashford has brought a small painting that Master Timothy created for you," Miss Hartwell reported. "And Lord Ashford has written a letter expressing gratitude for your support during his company's difficulties last quarter." Catherine nodded approvingly. This was exactly the kind of thoughtful gesture that made their family gatherings meaningful rather than merely obligatory. As evening approached, the palace staff completed their preparations with the same attention to detail they brought to state occasions, though the atmosphere was more relaxed. The private family dining room had been prepared with flowers from the palace gardens and table settings that were elegant but not intimidatingly formal. Edmund joined Catherine in her private sitting room as she made final preparations. She had chosen a dress that was beautiful but not overwhelming, royal enough to acknowledge her position, but accessible enough to put her family at ease. "Nervous?" he asked, adjusting his own attire for the evening. "Less than I used to be," Catherine admitted. "The first few dinners felt like performances where I was trying to be everyone's ideal version of themselves. Now I can just be myself with my family, even if that self happens to be Queen. That's quite an achievement. It's taken practice." They made their way to the family dining room, arriving a few minutes before their guests. The palace staff had outdone themselves in creating an atmosphere that was both welcoming and appropriately dignified. Fresh flowers added color without ostentation, and the lighting was warm enough to encourage conversation while still maintaining the elegance expected in a royal setting. The Ashford family arrived precisely on time, a punctuality that had become one of their ways of showing respect for Catherine's position. Richard and Sarah were dressed appropriately for dinner with royalty, but not overdressed for a family gathering. Their children and grandchildren followed their example, showing the lessons they had learned about fitting their behavior to the occasion. "Aunt Queen," Timothy called out, forgetting protocol in his excitement before catching himself and offering a careful bow. "I mean, Your Majesty, I brought you a picture I painted." Catherine accepted the small canvas with genuine delight. Timothy's artwork showed the palace gardens in bright, enthusiastic colors that captured the joy of childhood more than any technical accuracy. "It's beautiful, Timothy. I'll have it framed for my private study." The dinner proceeded with the smooth rhythm that had developed over months of practice. Conversation flowed naturally between family updates and gentle questions about royal duties. Richard shared news about his company's new contracts, legitimate business that had nothing to do with royal connections. Sarah described her latest jewelry designs and mentioned a commission from a local theater company. Margaret spoke enthusiastically about her engagement to a young doctor, and James updated everyone on his children's progress in school. The conversation was the kind that any close family might share, with the added element that one family member happened to be queen. "Catherine," Sarah said during the main course, using her sister-in-law's given name rather than her title, as had become customary during these private dinners. "I wanted to thank you for the advice you gave me about the jewelry business. Focusing on the quality of the work itself rather than trying to trade on family connections has made all the difference." "I'm glad it's working out," Catherine replied. "Your designs really are beautiful. You've found your own success." "It means more this way," Sarah admitted. "When people buy my jewelry because they genuinely love the pieces, not because they think it might somehow connect them to royalty, the satisfaction is completely different." Edmund, who had remained quietly attentive throughout most of the family conversation, smiled at this exchange. He had watched Catherine's family learn these lessons gradually, sometimes painfully, but ultimately with genuine understanding. The people gathered around this table bore little resemblance to the ambitious, presumptuous relatives who had caused such concern in the early months of the marriage. As dessert was served, Timothy's beloved chocolate souffle alongside fruit tarts and cheese selections, the conversation turned to lighter topics. The children shared stories from school, the adults discussed books they had been reading, and everyone enjoyed the comfortable atmosphere that had taken so much work to achieve. "Your Majesty," Helen said, addressing Catherine with the formal title she preferred to use even in family settings, "we've all been reading about your work with the Valdres Education Program. It sounds like it's been tremendously successful." "It has been," Catherine agreed, her face lighting up with enthusiasm. "We've been able to place teachers in schools that desperately needed additional support, and the cultural exchange has benefited everyone involved. The children are learning about different countries while getting the educational help they need." "Will you be expanding the program to other countries?" James asked. "We're exploring possibilities with 3 other kingdoms," Catherine replied. "Each situation is different, so we're taking our time to develop programs that will really work rather than rushing into commitments we can't fulfill properly." Richard listened to this discussion with evident pride. This was his sister, as he had always known her. Someone who cared deeply about making a positive difference in the world. The crown hadn't changed that fundamental aspect of her character. It had simply given her greater opportunities to express it. As the evening drew to a close, the family began preparing for their departure. The children hugged their aunt goodbye with the natural affection of loving relatives, while the adults expressed their gratitude for the evening with appropriate formality. "Thank you for another lovely evening," Richard said, taking Catherine's hand in both of his. "These dinners have come to mean more to us than I think you realize." "They mean a great deal to me, too," Catherine replied. "I'm grateful we've found a way to maintain our family bonds while respecting the requirements of royal life." After the family had departed, Catherine and Edmund walked slowly back to their private apartments. The palace felt peaceful in the aftermath of the gathering, as if the building itself appreciated these moments when formality gave way to genuine human connection. "How do you think it went?" Edmund asked. "I think it went perfectly," Catherine replied. "Not because nothing went wrong, but because everyone understood their role and played it well. We've all learned to be ourselves within the structure that royal life requires. Do you miss the way things used to be, before the crown complicated everything?" Catherine considered this question as they walked through the dimly lit corridors, past portraits of Edmund's ancestors who had faced their own challenges in balancing personal relationships with royal duties. "I miss the simplicity," she said finally. "But I don't miss the person I was before I learned to navigate these complexities. The crown has taught me things about myself that I never would have discovered otherwise. It's taught my family things about themselves, too. Such as that real love doesn't require special access or exclusive privileges, that supporting someone doesn't mean trying to benefit from their success, that family relationships can actually grow stronger when they're based on genuine care rather than opportunity." They reached Catherine's private sitting room, where a fire had been lit and evening tea prepared. The comfortable furniture and personal touches made this space feel like home within the grandeur of the palace. "What do you think your family has learned about you?" Edmund asked as they settled into chairs near the fireplace. "I think they've learned that becoming queen didn't make me a different person, but it did give me different responsibilities. And that those responsibilities sometimes require me to make decisions that disappoint people I love, not because I love them less, but because I love something larger than any individual relationship: the crown." "What the crown represents," Catherine clarified, "the stability and dignity that people depend on from their monarchy, the trust that citizens place in their royal family to put the greater good ahead of personal interest, the expectation that we'll be worthy of the privileges we've been given." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey they had traveled together and separately since their marriage. The early months had been tumultuous, filled with difficult choices and painful adjustments. But they had emerged from that period stronger, both as individuals and as a couple. "The palace feels different now," Edmund observed. "How so?" "More settled, less tense. As if everyone, family, staff, even the building itself, has found its proper rhythm." Catherine smiled at this fanciful notion, though she understood what he meant. There was indeed a sense of things being in their proper place, of relationships that had found sustainable foundations, of a royal household that functioned smoothly because everyone understood and accepted their roles. "Do you think we'll face challenges like this again?" she asked. "Different challenges, certainly. Royal life never stops testing the people who live it. But I think we've learned how to face those challenges together and how to make decisions that honor both our personal values and our public responsibilities." Later, as Catherine prepared for bed in her private chambers, she reflected on the evolution of her royal life. The woman who looked back at her from the mirror was different from the one who had married the king nearly 2 years earlier. She was more confident in her role, more secure in her relationships, and more certain of her ability to balance the competing demands of her position. The family dinner had reminded her of how far they had all come. Her relatives had transformed from people who saw royal connections as opportunities for advancement into people who understood that true family support meant respecting boundaries and celebrating achievements without trying to claim credit for them. She thought about Timothy's painting, which would indeed be framed and displayed in her study. It would serve as a reminder that the most meaningful gifts came from genuine affection rather than calculated gestures, and that the relationships she valued most were those built on love rather than advantage. The quiet that had settled over the palace was different from the tense silence that had followed her first difficult decisions about her family's role in royal life. This was a peaceful quiet, the calm of problems solved rather than problems avoided. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new tests of her commitment to both crown and family. But tonight, Catherine felt confident that she had found her way through the complexities of royal life without losing the essential parts of herself that made her who she was. The palace had indeed been forever changed by the events of the past year. But the change had been positive. Relationships had been tested and had emerged stronger. Boundaries had been established and had brought clarity rather than division. Most importantly, everyone involved had learned that love and duty didn't have to be opposing forces. They could work together to create something more stable and meaningful than either could achieve alone. As sleep overtook her, Catherine's last conscious thought was of gratitude for a family that had learned to support her in the way she needed, for a husband who had stood beside her through difficult decisions, and for the crown that had taught her so much about the person she was capable of becoming. The palace rested quietly around her, its ancient walls holding centuries of royal history. Catherine had added her own chapter to that history, a story of how love could survive the pressures of royal life when everyone involved was willing to grow, change, and put the greater good ahead of personal ambition. It was a lesson that would serve the monarchy well for generations to come.